The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November, um, while I was drinking my second cup of coffee and watching the deer move through the backfield behind my house. I recognized the number. It belonged to Gerald Hutchins, the attorney who had handled William Thorne's estate for the past 20 years. William had been dead for 45 days. Gerald said William left a sealed letter and a hard drive with a strict command, wait 45 days. I watched Jennifer on the patio, her grief already discarded for silk. The silence was finally over. If your best friend left you a secret from beyond the grave and asked you to wait 45 days, would you open it immediately or be patient enough to follow their final wish? Drop a comment and let me know. I drove to Gerald's office on a gray Asheville morning with the heater running and the radio off. The city was doing what mountain towns do in November, which is pretend at autumn without fully committing to it. The oaks were still half green, the air carrying just enough of a bite to justify a heavy jacket. Gerald handed me the sealed envelope with my name on it in William's handwriting. The sight of it tightened something in my chest. That handwriting, the deliberate, slightly left-leaning print of a man who had been told his penmanship was poor and had overcorrected his entire life, was more honest than anything else I could have been given. Gerald told me William was very clear about the 45 days. He didn't say why, only that it was vital. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table. Jennifer was at her weekly Pilates class. Over the past several weeks, she had returned to her routines with a speed I found difficult to name. It wasn't indecent, precisely. It was just calibrated. I opened the envelope. There was a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, and a small portable hard drive. Justin, the letter began. That single word in his handwriting nearly undid me before I had read another sentence. He wrote that if I was reading this, the 45 days were up, which meant the work was verified and organized. He told me he made Gerald promise to wait because he didn't want me going to the authorities with half a picture. He wanted me to have the whole thing. Then came the justification for his silence. William revealed a truth that turned my world into a stage set. He hadn't died of a natural cardiac event at 65. He died of what he called a managed exhaustion. He had spent his final months realizing that Jennifer, my wife, who had volunteered as his daily caregiver, was a chemical predator. He had watched her place supplements beside his breakfast plate every morning with a smile, while those same supplements were steadily increasing the strain on his heart until it simply stopped. He admitted his own silent regret. He had been the watchman of his own murder. He told me he had been trapped between the hope that he was wrong and the cold evidence that he was right. He had spent his last bit of energy not on resting, but on building a case file from his deathbed. William explained the 45-day buffer was his final gift to me. He needed that time to pass so I would have a reason to start paying attention. He knew that 45 days was long enough for Jennifer to settle into whatever came next. Long enough for me to see her mask of the grieving widow slip and for her social routines to resume with clinical efficiency. He wanted me to see the coldness for myself before the files confirmed it. She is going to try to kill you next, Justin. He wrote, you've been her backup plan from the beginning. Don't let her know you know. Not yet. These people are not careless. I sat there as the Blue Ridge mist crawled against the window. I wasn't a husband anymore. I was a man living with his own executioner, and my dead best friend was the only one standing between me and the grave. I plugged the hard drive into my laptop. My hands were steady, my mind shifting into the same cold precision I used for engineering schematics. There were 2 folders, Weston and Current. I opened Weston first. It was the blueprint of a predator's first kill. Gary Weston, Scottsdale, 2017. His death certificate said accidental overdose, a simple error in managing his blood thinners. He had been 61 and healthy. Pete Decker's notes showed Jennifer collected $850,000 and was gone in 6 months. She didn't just leave Scottsdale, she erased it. The Current folder was an autopsy of my own marriage. There were recordings From the workshop behind our house, the place Jennifer went for privacy, to call her sister, I clicked the first one. Her voice was sharp, devoid of the soft, lilting tone she used with me. She told someone that the timeline had to move up because Madison was asking too many questions. She said once William was gone and she was settled, I would become the priority. She said I was already attached and it wouldn't take much. Then I saw the lab reports. Pete had sent samples of the vitamins Jennifer gave me every morning, the ones she placed beside my breakfast with a kiss on the cheek. The report was 3 paragraphs of chemical death. They contained elevated warfarin derivatives, high-dose anticoagulants. They were designed to cause slow, cumulative internal bleeding. To her, this wasn't a murder. It was a managed deterioration. If I had a stroke or a fall, the medical examiner would see a middle-aged man with a heart condition and call it a tragic accident. I leaned back and looked at the screen, and that is when the clarity hit me. This is what I call the sociopathy of the mark. Most people think murder comes from a place of intense emotion, rage, jealousy, or even twisted love. But Jennifer didn't have room for that. She didn't hate me. To her, I simply wasn't a person. I was a $5 million account with a heartbeat. I was witnessing a purely transactional existence where human beings are reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. This human objectification is a predator's greatest tool. She looked at me and saw a resource to be harvested, nothing more. It was the ultimate illusion of power. She believed that because she could control my medicine and my money, she held the keys to my life. She didn't realize that a resource that knows it is being hunted is no longer a resource, it is a trap. The final document was the forged life insurance policy. $5 million with Jennifer listed as the sole beneficiary. She had taken it out 2 months before William died. She was already shopping for my coffin while William was still breathing. She had also opened a brokerage account in the Cayman Islands in William's name, siphoning off $650,000 in small increments. She was thorough, she was patient, but she had made one mistake. She assumed I was as blind as the men who came before me. This wasn't a marriage, it was a subscription, and I was footing the bill. But starting today, the payments were going to stop. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to balance the books once and for all. I started the swap that same afternoon. I drove 40 miles to a generic pharmacy in another county, far from anyone who might recognize me, to find bottles of vitamins that perfectly matched the ones she gave me. Every morning after that, I'd wake up at 5, long before her Pilates alarm chirped, and perform the switch. The real ones, the chemical death she was feeding me, went into a small plastic baggie tucked deep into the lining of my heavy winter coat. I watched the collection grow for 2 weeks. It was my evidence and my clock sitting at the breakfast table with the Blue Ridge sun hitting the mahogany. Everything looked like a magazine spread. She'd slide the glass of water toward me with that precision-calibrated smile and say, "Don't forget your health, honey." I'd look into her eyes, search for a flicker of humanity, and find only the reflection of a woman checking a task off a list. I'd swallow the safe pill and tell her the coffee was perfect. It was the most demanding performance of my life, a theater of the mundane where a missed cue could mean my actual death. It's a strange thing living in a prison without bars. To anyone looking in, through the large bay windows of our Asheville mansion, I was a successful man, living a comfortable life. But inside, I was a prisoner of the intimacy itself. Every time she brushed my shoulder or laughed at a joke, I felt the invisible chain of the survivor tighten around my throat. I've realized that a house is just a tomb with a better view when you know your executioner is the person sleeping next to you. The sensory details of our life became psychological weapons. The smell of her lavender perfume, once a comfort, now made my stomach turn with the scent of a funeral parlor. The sound of her stirring her herbal tea, 3 precise, rhythmic circles of the spoon against the porcelain felt like the ticking of a countdown. I wasn't just living, I was holding my breath in a room full of gas, waiting for the moment I could finally strike the match. I even leaned into the deception. I brought up the Nashville trip again, suggesting we look at five-star hotels near her sister's place. I needed her to see a man who was planning a spring he would never live to see. I watched her eyes light up with a calculation she thought was hidden behind her lashes. She wasn't seeing a vacation. She was seeing the perfect window of opportunity. To her, my enthusiasm was just proof that I was already attached, exactly like the recording said. My compassion had been a luxury she'd overdrafted for years, but now the account was closed. Every meal was a performance, every kiss was a transaction. I watched her move through the kitchen, graceful and lethal, and I realized that the hardest part wasn't the fear of dying. It was the cold, clinical realization that for 3 years I hadn't been a husband. I had been a long-term investment that was finally reaching its maturity date. But William Thorne had left me a different kind of balance sheet, and I was going to make sure every cent of this debt was paid in full. Madison Williams' 26-year-old daughter arrived at the house 2 days after I had opened the letter. She looked thinner, the grief of losing her father still etched into the dark circles beneath her eyes. We were sitting in the sunroom when she suddenly froze, her gaze locked onto Jennifer's right hand. Jennifer was wearing a deep ruby ring, a vintage piece with an ornate platinum setting. It was the same ring William had told me was promised to Madison on his deathbed, a piece that had supposedly gone missing the night he died. Jennifer noticed the stare and smiled, tilting her hand so the stone caught the Asheville mountain light. She told Madison that I had surprised her with it for our anniversary. I caught Madison's eye and gave a small, barely perceptible shake of my head. She went still, her grief sharpening into a cold, shared understanding. I didn't flinch. I didn't correct the lie. I just sat there like the silent investor in her version of family, watching her wear a trophy she had stolen from a man who was still warm when she took it. Later that evening, I decided to move the timeline up. I needed her to believe I was vulnerable. I told Jennifer over a glass of wine that I was feeling a bit restless and wanted to join my brother Roy for a long hunting weekend. For a long hunting weekend in the Pisgah National Forest. I saw the subtle shift in her posture, the predator finally scenting the kill. To make the trap irresistible, I added a specific detail. I told her I was worried about the recent string of break-ins in the Asheville area, so I had arranged to borrow a trained, aggressive guard dog from a friend to watch the estate while I was gone. I'll keep him in the outdoor kennel by the workshop, I told her with a concerned look, so if anyone comes by, tell them to stay far away from that fence. I didn't have a dog, and I wasn't getting one. But I knew Jennifer would pass that instruction to Silas Vance, an associate Williams' files revealed was acting as her muscle. The next morning, I met with Detective Garza and Pete Decker at a secure location downtown. They had been working through the night to verify the current folder on Williams' hard drive. The forgery was confirmed. Jennifer had taken out a $5 million life insurance policy in my name using a forged signature. Garza showed me the warrant for her phone records. She had been in constant contact with Silas, planning a botched robbery during the exact window I was supposed to be at Roy's place. We have the financial fraud already, Garza said, his voice level and clinical. But if you want the conspiracy and the attempted murder charges to stick, we need Silas on the property with clear intent to cause harm. I told him the bait was set. The house would be empty, and the imaginary dog would be the only thing they thought stood in their way. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I drove back to the mansion. I was walking into a crime scene that hadn't happened yet, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the target, I was the architect. That night, Jennifer was unusually affectionate. She made an elaborate dinner filet mignon and a heavy red wine. She kept touching my hand, her eyes bright with the excitement of a woman who was finally about to close a high-stakes deal. She talked about our future, about all the things we would do once I was retired. I listened to every word, and for every lie she told, I added another line to the balance sheet in my head. My compassion had been a luxury she had overdrafted for too long. Now I was just waiting for the check to finally bounce. I loaded my truck on Friday morning while the mountain fog was still thick enough to hide the truth. Jennifer stood on the porch in her silk bathrobe, holding a mug of herbal tea, her expression a masterclass in performative concern. She told me to have a safe trip and to enjoy the hunting, never once suspecting that she was the one being tracked. I drove 40 minutes to a hotel in Hendersonville, checked in under my legal name to establish a paper alibi, and then doubled back to a surveillance van where Pete Decker and Detective Garza were waiting. We sat in a silence that felt heavy and clinical, watching the monitors that now served as the windows into my own life. At 3 in the afternoon, a dark gray pickup truck, registered to a shell company, pulled to the edge of my property. We watched the driver spend 7 minutes examining the back entrance with the cold eyes of a man looking at a job site rather than a home. He returned at 9 that evening, this time carrying a bag of tools. The high-definition cameras caught every movement as he cut the screen on the laundry room window, but it was the audio that provided the final entry in Jennifer's ledger of crimes. The directional microphone caught her voice perfectly as she stood in the shadows of the backyard, giving the driver Silas his final instructions over the phone. She told him that the handgun was in the top drawer of the desk in my study. She told him he had to make it look like a break-in gone wrong, and then came the line I had baited for her. And Silas, she said, her voice devoid of any human warmth, be careful with the dog. He is aggressive. There was no dog. I had told her I had borrowed a high-strung guard dog to see if she was even listening to the details of my life. She wasn't. She was only listening for the sounds of opportunity. Detective Garza's team struck at exactly 9:47. Silas was inside the study, his fingers curling around the handle of the desk drawer, when 3 officers came through the doors. He dropped to his knees before he could even register that the trap had closed. I was told that when Jennifer was confronted in the backyard, she didn't scream or try to run. She looked at the officers with a face that Pete described as pure calculation, as if she were simply reevaluating the market value of her freedom. I arrived back at the house just as they were placing her in the back of a cruiser. I walked to the window and looked at the woman I had shared a bed with for 3 years. She looked back at me without surprise and without a single shred of remorse. I held up a plastic evidence bag, already tagged and sealed by the forensics team. Inside were the 14 days of warfarin-laced supplements I had meticulously swapped and saved. They were the chemical receipts of her betrayal. I leaned close to the glass, my voice calm and factual. Jennifer, I saved these for you, I said. I think you are going to need your vitamins where you are going. I watched her eyes narrow, the calculator in her head finally hitting an error code. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the investment. I was the person who had finally foreclosed on her. The trial in Asheville was a clinical deconstruction of a predator. The recordings of Jennifer's voice, patient and entirely without remorse, filled a room where the air felt too thin to breathe. The jury took only 9 hours to return their verdict. Jennifer received 2 consecutive life sentences. Silas Vance, facing the weight of his own debts and the irrefutable evidence against him, accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 22 years. The authorities in Scottsdale reopened Gary Weston's cold case, and after a grueling 8-month investigation, they reclassified his death as a homicide, ensuring that Jennifer's past would finally anchor her to a cell for the rest of her life. I sold the Asheville mansion the following year. Once the final gavel had fallen and the legal shadows had lifted, I had to. The house had become a place where my murder was planned over morning coffee and discussed in the quiet of the workshop. I bought a smaller place outside Dripping Springs to be near my brother Roy. Madison and her husband flew down to help me move. We spent the evening sitting on the back porch, telling stories about William that had nothing to do with medicine or spreadsheets. The $650,000 recovered from the frozen Cayman accounts and returned through court-ordered restitution felt heavy in my hands, a reminder of the price William had paid. I used every cent of it to establish the William Thorne Legacy Fund. We provide legal support and investigative expertise for elderly victims of financial fraud, the kind of crimes that are easy to dismiss because the victims are often too ashamed to speak up. This was my act of planting a seed. I've learned that the best revenge isn't just the destruction of an enemy, it is the architecture of a future they can never touch. I've come to realize that some people walk among us with a calculator where a conscience should be. They don't see a husband or a friend, they see a maturity date on an investment. Jennifer's precision calibrated warmth was the most expensive thing I ever bought. If you find yourself in a situation where someone's sympathy feels too scripted or their care feels like a checklist, please do not ignore that whisper in your head. Trusting your intuition isn't a sign of paranoia. It is your survival instinct trying to keep you breathing. Forgiveness is a word people throw around easily, but I've learned that it isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's just the final step of setting yourself free from the prison they built for you. I don't carry the weight of her betrayal anymore. I carry the memory of a man who loved me enough to leave me the truth from beyond the grave. I am no longer just a resource that survived. I am a man who is finally living. Justice is a long game, but when you have a friend who watches over you, even after they are gone, you've already won. If this story reminded you to cherish a true friend or trust your gut, share it with someone you care about. I'll see you in the next one.